So Mark, having thanked you and honored you, I'm going to blame you a little bit. You helped get this whole technology revolution started.
Long time from cell phones.
But having been in events with Mark, please do not turn off your cell phone. And if you feel the need to tweet or text, and there are minutes or text charges with them, that's a good thing as far as Mark's concerned. But Mark, you've also been a big part of the solution. So I do want to go right to one of the pressing issues of the day, something that I know you're energized about, and I know a lot of Americans are looking to you for leadership and guidance on this, which is the last election and the hacking of an election. We've never really talked about the hacking of an election before. That itself is an innovation. Where is this? It is. I mean, innovation, innovation is neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It is what it is. So, and where are we on this? As somebody that comes out of the technology world in particular, but then also has spent time, a great part of your career being a leader on foreign policy and intelligence, where do we stand right now?
So much for foreplay. It's a wild time. It is, to say the least. And first of all, let me congratulate everybody involved in TomTom and what a remarkable event this is for Charlottesville, but also, and I say this with some trepidation, in Charlottesville, for the incredible amount of entrepreneurship that is happening all over Virginia. And I said earlier at the founders' kind of reception, Austin, eat your heart out. So congratulations for everybody involved. This is, though, this moment in time, and what our country has gone through in the last year plus is, to me, maybe the most remarkable thing I've experienced in my, at least, life in politics. And it is not unique. The unfortunate thing is it's not unique to America. Some of the activities that we saw take place in America in 2016 have been taking place in other nations, particularly in Eastern Europe, for the last decade plus. There's a lot we don't know, but let me tell you what we do know. We do know, and this is without, I think, any contradiction from everyone at least involved in the intelligence community, whether it be the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, the Director of National Intelligence. There's actually 17 different intelligence agencies that make up the intelligence community. And they all came to this conclusion, that Russia massively tried to intervene in our election. Now, Russia has intervened in other elections, particularly in Eastern Europe. There have been efforts at espionage before, but this was really the first time when we've seen the force of modern technology combined with espionage and other techniques in a way that is fundamentally different. Russia and others have always tried to hack into various countries' information. They hacked into both political parties in America. One of the things that maybe isn't fully realized, and this came out of public testimony in our hearing about 10 days ago, is that the massive hack really, they've only released about 5% of the information that they were able to kind of penetrate. Russia's goal was not to be pro-Republican or pro-Democratic. What their goal was to sow chaos, not just here, but they've done the same currently in France. They tried to penetrate the Dutch elections to the point a few weeks ago that the Dutch actually counted all their ballots by hand because of the fear of interference. I met with the head of the German intelligence the last week, and Russians have penetrated the whole Bundestag, their parliament. So their effort, and Putin's effort, is to discredit democracies everywhere, because actually Russia themselves will have an election later, and they want to say, hey, this democracy stuff is not so hot. Look at how much of a mess it is in Western countries. What happened that was different in this election was, at some point, Putin and the Russian leadership decided that they didn't want to simply sow chaos, but they actually wanted to favor one candidate over another. And so the information that they obtained, rather than leaking out, bad information about both sides, leaked out solely against one candidate, Mrs. Clinton, and at some point they actually came to favor Mr. Trump. And the things that took place, let me kind of get this all out and then we can get into questions, is there is a series of facts that really kind of make it all very mysterious. One, I grew up at a time when, as a Democrat, then the party that was the most anti-communist was always the Republicans. But strangely enough, in this campaign, the one thing that changed in the Republican platform from Mitt Romney's platform of 2012, strangely enough, was the clause that basically made the Republican platform this year, for the first time ever, more pro-Russia and anti-Ukraine. And interestingly enough, 3 days after that platform change was the first of the leaked information on the DNC hacked information. Subsequent to that, we then had then-candidate Trump basically say, hey, Russians, if you've got information, hack into Hillary Clinton and show her up. We saw individuals associated and affiliated with Mr. Trump indicate that they, encouraged more of these actions. We had one associate of Mr. Trump who said, at some point soon, John Podesta, who was Clinton's campaign chair, it'll be his time in the barrel. And ultimately, a series of hacked information that started with the DNC hacks, spread to the Podesta hacks, ended up using individuals such as Guccifer II, who was a Russian agent, ended up using WikiLeaks, as some folks have believed WikiLeaks was at some point an activist group for true information. If you follow over the last couple of years, it's only been an activist of information that discredits democracy across not only our country but other countries. That in itself would be extraordinarily frightening in terms of the ability to kind of hack in and release information. But what we've also seen are two other things that really should make us all, regardless of who you supported. We've seen Russia use these techniques in places like Hungary and Bulgaria and others. And Bill, I know, you've led a completely pure life, and if someone hacked into your information, there'd be nothing there you did not want to share. But what we've seen Russians been able to use with this technology is, if you've got a pure background, what Russians have used against other parliamentarians in other countries is they say, okay, if there's not anything there that's embarrassing, they can actually impose onto your files, for example, what they did a Bulgarian politician, a child pornography file on your computer, and then call the cops and say, check out Bill's computer, you might find something interesting. That level of technology being used against people with both accurate information and disinformation is really unprecedented. That in itself would be something that should make us all fearful. But what they also were able to do was use this technology that we've all celebrate here with TomTom, that we've seen this enormous economic growth and empowerment with the internet. But what they also were able to do, and again, this is kind of beyond dispute, was they had close to 1,000 paid internet trolls, people that would manipulate information on the internet. And what these trolls would do was they would set up bots where you would go out and in effect create a series of fake Twitter accounts or fake Facebook accounts. And then, because if you were a young person, and particularly many of our kids, millennials, who don't ever read the newspaper or watch TV, and if all you get is your news coming off your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed, what these internet bots were able to do was in effect flood the zone, strangely enough, in certain states like Wisconsin and Michigan, where the Democrats were too asleep at the switch to even realize they were competitive. And if you were certain demographics in states like Wisconsin and Michigan in the last week, your Twitter or Facebook news feed would not be what, Clinton versus Trump in terms of whatever was day to day. You would get across your news feed because it would be the highest ranking algorithm. You would get Hillary Clinton sick. Hillary Clinton stole billions of dollars from the State Department, or the one that got some attention afterwards, that Hillary Clinton and John Podesta were running some kind of child sex ring out of a pizza parlor in DC in the basement in a building that had no basement. And we laugh, but on one level, the ability to manipulate information, and this is the actual fake news, not what others have said, is really at an unprecedented level. And we had a series, again, panel of experts who were both technical and kind of, in terms, these are called Russian active measures, testify that one of the things that accelerated this was that you then had then-candidate Trump actually, accelerating some of these stories because he would follow what was the kind of Russian propaganda line. For example, up until the actual election, the Russian internet trolls and others were trying to spread the election that, gosh, the election's going to be rigged. Those were the exact words that then-candidate Trump used until election night. So what we need to worry, and what the Senate is trying to do, and is say, all right, how do we, these items are pretty well factually based, and I think most senators, Democrat and Republican, realize this. How do we find out what else in terms of conversation or potential collaboration? And again, we're unprecedented in the time in the first, not even 100 days, but 75 days of administration where you've had a national security advisor have to resign because of his, conversations that he didn't disclose with Russians, where you've had the Attorney General have to recuse himself. And there's a lot more that needs to be investigated. So looking back, we have to figure out what happened, and we know we owe the American people the truth. And if nothing happened, I'll be the first to stand up and say nothing happened. But we have to, in a bipartisan way, follow the intel wherever it leads. And on a going forward basis, we have to take a pause for a moment. And as somebody who's been longer in technology than I have been in politics, I think, frankly, we have to have a whole re-examination of some of the companies that we have kind of grown to depend upon. And I think, some of the founders of Facebook and Twitter and Google and others are, great individuals. But the notion that they are simply pass-throughs on information and they have no responsibility to curate, I think we have to rethink. I grew up at a time when the news would come on, and I'm old enough to remember Walter Cronkite, and you actually believed what he said was true. We now have, in an era without curation, when technology can put forward information that if we don't have an informed electorate, may be very well making decisions and choices based on stuff that is just plain factually inaccurate.
So it's a sweeping set of issues, and the combination of malicious forces, self-referential groups that are reading their own material and not circulating, the lack of a common voice that everybody trusts. In the midst of all this, the federal government was aware that some of the hacking was happening during the campaign. What did they know? When did they know it? And who were they watching, and why were they or were they not communicating to the public about it?
I'd love to tell you and everyone here all that, but I'd have to kill you. No, I think that, candidly, as somebody who supported President Obama and supported Hillary Clinton, but I believe that in many ways the administration was remiss in not elevating this issue earlier. I only became part of the so-called Gang of Eight, which is the group that gets, a regular senator gets some information. On the Intel Committee, you get more. If you're part of the so-called Gang of Eight, which are the heads, the chair and vice chair of the Intel Committees, and the respective majority leader and speaker and minority leaders, you're supposed to hear it all. But I think there was evidence, and the FBI director indicated that some of these, he opened investigations as early as July, that this should have been brought more to the public's attention. On October 6th or 7th, I can't recall, 3 things that happened that were very interesting. That was the day, one, that the so-called Access Hollywood tape broke that indicated some of Mr. Trump's comments about women. Within an hour of that was also the first release of the John Podesta emails. Some might say that's more than coincidence. And the third thing was, that kind of got washed out in the news of that day, the director of national intelligence and the head of Department of Homeland Security wrote an unprecedented letter basically saying the Russians were trying to interfere in our elections, but that kind of got buried. And I think history will show that, frankly, the Obama administration should have been more leaning in at an earlier time just to put Americans on guard about what was happening.
Is it illegal for a campaign to talk to a foreign government? Is it illegal for a transition official to talk to a foreign government like the Russians?
I don't think there is. I think, one, we're in a whole set of issues that are, to a degree, unprecedented. I think there are open questions about illegality or not. I went to law school, but I never practiced a day of law, so I wouldn't want to weigh in on that. But there have been assertions of whether there was knowledge about what information could be released or not released. And end of the day, I'm not interested in relitigating the election. But I am interested in finding the truth. I am interested in making sure that going forward that we have a cyber policy, both defensive and offensive. This is not just a threat to our democracy when we celebrate Jefferson's birthday. And again, regardless of where you stand on the political aisle, we ought to be deeply offended at the actions just of what we know. We ought to be concerned that the same thing is happening right now in France, where the Russians have actually weighed in on behalf of the far-right candidate and the more moderate candidate. Suddenly stories have come out about his personal life that may be the same kind of activities. And this doesn't just happen in democracy. I was at Langley Airfield a couple days ago. Some of our top fighter jets there are saying, what are our adversaries doing? They're saying the Chinese are quickly competing with us, and it's not because they were able to develop that technology, it's because they were able to hack in and basically discover some of our secrets. So, this is not just about democracy, national security. I don't think there's a hospital in Virginia that hasn't been the victim of potential ransomware attacks where somebody will hack in, get the private information, and basically hold hostage the hospital unless they pay them off. And think about it for a moment as we think through national security. If you add together the cost, the presumed cost of what the Russians have done in America, the Netherlands, potentially involvement in Brexit, France, Germany, that's less than roughly 2 to 3% of a cost of a single aircraft carrier. So we clearly have a nation that can take on anyone in terms of military to military, but in many ways, because of our technology dependence, we are in certain ways more vulnerable in a world of cyber war. We are more vulnerable, when we think about our overhead architecture in terms of satellites. We have the world's best, but I sometimes feel like, American policy assumed that we were going to control space forever. So people have described some of our satellites as extraordinarily exquisite, but like they are big fat cows floating in space. And it's almost like nobody from the military and the intelligence community ever saw a James Bond movie. Because I remember Thunderball and all the others. The bad guys always used laser beams to blow up a satellite, and this is all in the public domain. Recently, China sent a satellite up and then showed a laser beam that blew it up to just demonstrate their capabilities. So, with technology comes enormous benefits, but also comes challenges around privacy, around how we think about ourselves in an asymmetrical conflict. And really, as we talk now, and I don't want to be, this is a time for festival, but for a moment, we have to realize in many ways when our core democracy is at stake and that democratic process, and if people lose confidence in that process, then everything's up for grabs.
Well, and it's a good bridge to something that you've spent a lot of time on and want you to spend a little time on with us. There's another sense in which technology has been disruptive in our democracy, and that's the economic underpinnings, that there are clear winners of technology spread all across the country, and even within a state like Virginia, big parts of Virginia that have benefited and others that haven't. And one argument for the anti-establishment anger, forget about who people voted for, but that riles our politics and why people lose faith in public institutions has to do with a lot of people left out by that. Is that a fair assessment? Do you think that that is a driving force? And if it is, is there anything we can do about it?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, again, what TomTom is all about is entrepreneurship. And we ought to celebrate that. 80% of all the net new jobs that have been created in the last 30 years come from startups. So we ought to celebrate that. But not everybody should become an entrepreneur. I failed a few times before I made it. I'm very lucky. But what I worry when we've got the far left and the far right, and frankly, the state of the political debate being fairly brain dead where I work on a daily basis. And,
because you're not in Charlottesville enough.
Well, simply, people re-arguing about backward-looking issues. I would argue that, frankly, both political parties are kind of backward-looking. Mr. Trump wants to take us back to, a glorified age of the 50s, when if you're a white guy, it might have been pretty good, but for everybody else, maybe not. Some parts of the Democratic Party wants to take us back to a kind of a big regulatory state and total redistribution. When I think what is at stake is, and I say this as a former entrepreneur and somebody who believes in the free enterprise system, but I think modern American capitalism is not working for enough people. And we need to restore that. And let me not give you the whole spiel, but let me give you 3 things that I think we ought to, where I wish the political debate should be headed. Something is wrong in modern capitalism when the average hold on a public stock's gone from 8 years to 4 months. Something's wrong when 50% of corporate profits that used to be reinvested in the business, now 95% of corporate profits are not reinvested, but spent on share buyback and dividends. And when public companies rush for quarterly based returns, and oftentimes at the expense of human beings, and frankly at the expense of long-term creation of value. Something's wrong when 1/3 of the workforce, and we're not going to go back to a time when everybody's going to work for the same company for forever. My dad worked for the same company for 38 years. I know our time's running out, but just, we're not going to go back to that age. 1/3 of the workforce right now are entrepreneurs, part-time, gig workers, independent contractors. We need to have a social safety net that meets them where they are. That 1/3 of the workforce has no social insurance because we've made social insurance contingent upon full-time work. We need a portable benefit system that allows people to have some level of social insurance and allow them to move from job to job to job as they become entrepreneurs and more creative. We need to realize as well, let me get this out, the truth is right now, and with technology, globalization, I know there was an earlier session today around AI, and we think about machine learning, and the effects we've seen now are nothing compared to what 10 years from now will bring. There is absolutely no economic incentive today for anybody in a company to invest in upskilling or training anyone that makes less than, say, $50,000 or $60,000. And quite honestly, I say this as a former governor and senator, most government training programs don't work. Training programs that work are much better driven by businesses and others. And you ought to have independent metrics. We ought to change our tax code to actually incent businesses, and I would change business spending on meaningful training below a certain income cut line that results in certification and upskilling. Change those dollars spent from a tax deduction to a tax credit. And frankly, if we do repatriation and bring all those corporate tax revenues back, which we ought to do as we get more competitive, we ought to make a prerequisite that every company that brings those money back puts in place a meaningful training program for low and moderate income people. So they have a sense that if they work hard, that capitalism is still going to give them a fair shot. So changing that business cycle to focus long-term versus short-term, portable benefits, a notion around training, and frankly, we ought to also, last point, is what gives me hope is that a lot of pension funds are starting to think this way. They say we're going to invest in companies with environment, societal, and governance issues, ESG. A lot of millennials want to work for and buy from companies that have some level of social responsibility. Government shouldn't touch this, but we ought to create an XPrize out there that would get all the groups that want to encourage good business behavior, the B Corp and inclusive capitalism and conscientious capitalism, assorted groups, SASB and others, and go out and say, let's create one standard and let the market drive those investors and those consumers who want to reward companies who actually treat their workforce with some level of dignity and respect and fair wages. I think the market can work But we've got to slightly align the incentives, and this may not be a perfect solution set, but it would be a heck of a lot better if we were debating these issues than the same back and forth of both parties trying to blame each other on an agenda that's 20th century focused.
I think we all agree that we could go all night with Mark. I've got a flashing red 5 at me, which means that we're probably about 5 minutes over. Mark, thank you. Senator Warner, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We couldn't have an Innovators Festival and a Founders Festival without Mark with us.
Let me just add, the only thing I'd ask y'all, is the one thing I'd ask. I know if you're here tonight, you believe, but as much as you want to throw a shoe at the TV when the news comes on, don't do that. You know, our system will only work if everybody participates. And if you tune out, or tune off, all you do is turn the keys over to the wingnuts on either side of the political spectrum. And our country's too good for that. Thank you all very much.